well in the Sufi orders, this idea that, you know, we can do something new, we can create this planet into being a good place. That's where the Baha'i tradition came from. They were kind of Muslim New Agers, if you want. And Sufi orders were involved with that. And all different Freemasonic groups were all bubbling away, trying to say, let's have, you know, let's find the lost word, which is what Freemasons are looking for. And let's rebuild, you know, the temple of humanity. So all those ideas are around. Theosophy was a channel for this. A man called A.R. Orage, who was on the fringes of esoteric stuff in London, created a journal called The New Age. And he published a lot of these people in the 20s in London and before the 20s. He published people like Yeats and what we would call New Age thinkers, you know. A lot of them were some kind of socialists or Fabians who wanted to reform society. Because on the whole, New Age people say it's not enough just to become like a spiritually enlightened person. You have to change the social structures around you. You can't just be enlightened in your bubble and meanwhile other people are out there raping and killing and stealing. You know, you have to do something for society. And so the Fabian Society was a kind of, it was an offshoot of a thing called the Fellowship of the New Brotherhood, Fellowship of the New Life, founded by Thomas Davidson, a Scottish-British philosopher, who founded like a society, a sort of order to advance this New Age concept. And some Fabians created the Fabian Society, which became the sort of activist wing within the socialist movement in Britain, set up the Labour Party to try and reform society so that we have pensions, people don't have to die in squalor, and people live with no heating. I mean, unfortunately the Tory party has forgotten all this stuff. They seem to stand for the old age. They seem to want to repress all these progressive ideas that have been developed in the last 100 years and just walk all over it, you know. But I note that in the polls they're now saying Labour will win a huge election victory at the next general election, which I think is long overdue. So the New Age, yes, some of the figures behind it would be Jakob Böhmer, who was a great German pietist thinker who sort of envisioned the world anew. He influenced many later philosophers. William Blake, another 18th century visionary, mystic, druid, Christian, esoteric, who was baptised in the font at St James Church in Piccadilly, which I used to attend, and an artist. We have to put Blavatsky in, the founder of Theosophy, because she talked about a New Age. And also Rudolf Steiner, who was the head of the German branch of the Theosophical Society and also was involved in the New Age. But then it sort of caught on. I think as an offshoot of Theosophy, the work of Alice Bailey is worth mentioning. Alice Bailey was a Scottish esoteric student. She was descended from an interesting Dutch ambassador from Britain, the most important ambassador from Britain to Holland, who'd helped bring in what's called the Glorious Revolution. And so she came from a sort of long line of nobility, sort of aristocrats, if you want, but intellectual aristocrats, not sort of greedy landlords. And she was brought up in Scotland partly, and she was interested in esoteric matters, and she describes in her autobiography, which I think I have somewhere very close to hand, how a sort of stranger looked like a Sikh suddenly turned up in her room in Scotland. She was a teenager, but he manifested out of thin air and was there, and he became her teacher. She was obviously very sensitive, and these are some of her books which she then channeled. This one's called Education in the New Age. She became a Christian. She was married to a vicar for a while, but he was very much of the old school, like you either become a Christian or you go to hell type of teachings. She was much more intelligent than that, and he was in India promulgating that kind of hell and damnation theology, and she thought this was ridiculous. So she parted company And she acted as a inspirer of people who'd been in the army and were down on their luck, and she went around Belfast, and she became quite well known for giving talks to give people hope, you know. She ended up going to California, escaping from the crazy husband who'd started beating her up. Not a good idea. Got the children out, went to California, totally broke, working in a sardine factory. And then she met and fell in love with a guy called Foster Bailey, bless him, who was a member of the Theosophical Society, a Freemason, and a very grounded, loving kind of guy. And they became a dynamic couple, Foster Bailey and Alice Bailey, during the rest of the 20s, 30s and 40s, and she lived on to the early 50s, I think. And she discovered that she could channel writings, so she sort of invented this. Well, no, she wasn't the first, but she was an early practitioner of channeling. So she'd sort of sit in the dusk and just write and not really know what she's writing, and then read it, and oh, that's interesting. And then Foster would type it all up, and they'd publish it, and it became about 40 different books, which I studied and written academic papers on. And it's one of the most influential of all the New Age religions, if you want. Is this is her unfinished autobiography, because she started it and then she got too busy to finish it. I know the feeling. I'm having that problem at the moment. I've got my biography up till 2017, and that was 5 years ago. I don't have time to do any more. But her biography is absolutely brilliant, and I recommend it if you're interested. On June the 30th, 1895, I had an experience which has made that date for me one that I never forget and always keep. I had been for months in the throes of adolescent mysteries. Life was not worth living. There was nothing but sorrow and trouble on every hand. This is 1895, right? I'd not asked to come into the world, but here I was. I was just 15. Nobody loved me, etc., etc. You know, I love Alice Bailey's work. I didn't meet her, but I did meet quite a few people that knew her when I was in London, sort of studying all this stuff. Kept bumping into people that were connected to Alice Bailey, and that's what made me study her. And I thought, that must be an interesting person. And I knew a guy called Steve Nation, who ran the Lucis Trust in London. I don't know that he'd met her, but he certainly knew people who had. He might have met some of her children. She had some children. She travelled quite a lot. She was a friend of Fraulein Kapteyn, who set up the Uranus conferences with Jung in Switzerland at Monte Veritas in Switzerland, and she met Jung. So she was, we now call her a New Age networker. You know, the term didn't exist in her days. She was a light worker. The books are about how you can focalize and use the power of meditation. That's why I do a daily meditation every day. You don't need long, you just have to focus and channel that spiritual energy and intention. Now because she worked in a theosophical context, she believed she was directly under the theosophical hierarchy of masters or divine teachers. And her particular guru, if you want, was Djwhal Khul, who was a young Tibetan boy originally. Then he became the abbot of a monastery in Tibet, and he used to channel to her. She's sitting there in California taking notes from his dictation. He's 10,000 miles away in Tibet, right? Now that's what she claims. I got interested in this because I'd studied it and thought, well, this is interesting. And I was doing a history degree, and I was annoyed that the history degree was all about wars and politics and diplomacy, and there's nothing on the esoteric history. And so I wrote a paper for the Theosophical Society History Club about the historical background to Alice Bailey's work, asking, well, were there any Tibetan monasteries around? I mean, if that Djwhal Khul guy actually lived, where might he have been the abbot? What years exactly was she supposed to be channeling all this stuff? Would it fit? You know, is there any possible historical veracity behind all this? Or is it just something made up in her head? Anyway, that's the question I asked. I gave the talk. It was recorded. I've not had time to type it up yet because it was recorded on really those tiny cassette things you used to get. But no, it's fascinating stuff, and she argued, the books argue, the channeling gets interesting during the 30s because it's saying there's trouble coming, the dark lodges are active, and we're calling all the light workers to kind of come together and defend democracy, to defend civilized values and so on. And so if you set that against the rise of Nazism and fascism and Stalinism and all the horrors of that, it turns out that the light workers, which Alice Bailey calls the hierarchy, were the kind of sages and saints of the planet at the time, rallying to defend civilization against the forces of evil. And so she's writing the script of the inner history of the 20th century, effectively. And of course, when I discovered that, I thought, this is really interesting. This is historically interesting material. And I suspended judgment, if it's true or not, or what kind of truth. Is it just her subjective truth, or is it, was there really a decay? Yes, one of the people I met at the Theosophical History Conference was a very interesting woman called Jean Overton Fuller. Now, Jean Overton Fuller was a great woman. I met her at the end of her life. She's sadly dead now. She'd been involved in British intelligence in World War II, probably about, the same age as my mother. She became a historian, a scholar. She was interested in Sufism. She was friends with the people that ran the Sufi Order of the West, which Hazrat Inayat Khan and Pir Veliat Khan promoted from India. They came to the West and said, Sufism is a beautiful thing, try and do this. And I was very close to the Sufi Order of the West, and still, greatly respect them. The daughter of the founder of the order, Noor Inayat Khan, trained as a British Secret Service agent in World War II because as a Muslim and a Sufi, she felt so against the Nazis, what they were doing. She volunteered to be a secret agent. And she was flown into France and she was dropped by parachute. And for some weeks, she was typing out secret messages back to London to help the resistance and so on. And then the Nazis captured her. I don't know how, somehow. They found out she was in some remote farmhouse, could have been near here. They captured her and then they tortured her because they wanted to know who she was working with, what were her chums called. Gruesome, horrible, and then eventually she was killed. She was tortured to death, and she was a beautiful young woman in her early 20s or something. Now, Jean Overton Fuller knew her and was a friend of hers, and she felt so annoyed about this murder, this death. She came to Germany after the war and found the guy that had tortured her, who was now demobbed civilian, ex-Nazi soldier, and she interviewed him. And she wrote the story in the biography about, Noor and Nisa, the light of women, the name means. So anyway, that's the kind of calibre Jean Overton Fuller. She was a thorough and deep person. And by the way, the German guy she interviewed, apologised. He said, I hadn't got a clue what I was doing. I was just following orders, Had I known, I wouldn't have done it. But of course, it's too late, Anyway, Jean then researched and wrote an amazing biography of Blavatsky, who was the founder of the Theosophical Society from the Ukraine, who Alice Bailey thought very highly of. She loved Blavatsky's work. And Jean Overton Fuller wrote a biography of Blavatsky in which she tracks down that Blavatsky did make it to Tibet. That's, did she or didn't she? I think Jean Overton Fuller proves that she did make it to Shigatse, which is called Tashilhunpo, where there was a great monastery attached to the Panchen Lama. We all know about the Dalai Lama, who was a genius. We all love the Dalai Lama. I've met him, great man. But the esoteric head of Tibetan Buddhism was the Panchen Lama, who was the teacher. Dalai Lama is just like the Prime Minister. He smiles and gives you a white cloth and shakes hands and, The actual teacher is the Panchen Lama, who was based at Shigatse, which is not in Lhasa, it's 100 miles away. And it's thought that Blavatsky, as a young woman, made it there, overland, because she was a really deep student of the mysteries. And she got to the inner ashram of the Panchen Lama in the 1860s, about 1863 to 65. Stayed there a couple of years studying, teaching, learning from these teachers, who she then called her masters. One of them was, and they were not just Tibetan Buddhists, they were esoteric teachers from far and wide. One was a Sikh, Master Moria, and one was a young boy, a young chela or apprentice called Jwal Khul. And he was there physically with Blavatsky, according to Jean Overton Fuller, who did amazing research, and you can read it all in her biography of Blavatsky. Now, okay, so put that together with the Bailey materials. I think it's very possible that that boy who was alive in the 1860s as a young man might well have lived on into the 1920s as an old abbot. And he was obviously pretty intelligent, pretty cosmically enlightened, should we say. And I'm not a telepath, I'm not a channeler, you know, I don't know how you can do that stuff, but I'm not, in my universe, I think it's possible that some people can do this stuff. And so, it's possible. I suspend judgment. But anyway, it's what the teachings talk about is there will be a time of peace after the war's over. The Dark Lodges will be defeated. People that do black occultism will be, you know, taken out by their own stupidity, because if you do evil, it defeats yourself, because you're torturing your own soul if you do evil. And the kind of Nazis that were torturing people to death, I mean, it's not good for them. It's terrible for them. I mean, there was one chap shot in this village, Betet, by the Nazis. He was a resistance worker. You know, this, I mean, if you go to the mysteries, as I said earlier on in this talk, you discover that you have to pursue a life of righteousness and truth and love and non-violence. People that use force and violence are cheating. You know, Putin's cheating. I mean, he's fascinated by the mysteries. He kind of likes the occult, but he thinks you can do it with violence. No, you can't, you know. So Bailey's work is very important, and after the war they set up this thing, the Lucis Trust. Well, I think it was set up earlier, the Lucis Trust, and it carried on. It's got offices in London, Geneva, New York, and at one point in Tokyo. And it's trying to get a sort of new world based on peace and brotherhood and love. They have certain teachings. You can subscribe to their newsletters, and you can get, you know, advice and guidance on how to meditate, and how to, you know, develop your spiritual work. And I've known many people that have been through those courses, and they're good people on the whole. I've never met one that wasn't on the path to enlightenment. And also there's her book Esoteric Healing, about the psychological causes of disease. She argues in this book, or DK does through her, that medicine will become more about causes of disease rather than just treating symptoms. That it won't be about zapping cancer tumours, you know, from which we probably all die anyway, but thinking and meditating so that you don't get the tumours, and how you can do that. So it's full of practical ideas. She also argues that the religions of the world are going to reach a kind of synthesis, that Christ, Islam, Muhammad, Buddha, at that level, those ascended masters are all working in harmony. They're not in rivalry, it's their disciples down on this earth plane that are fighting. And that the masters, the heavenly hierarchy, are definitely trying to get us all into a place of unity and harmony. Not sort of blend into one religion, but keeping each other's cultures, you know, and practices and customs, but living in harmony with each other. And so the books are a kind of guide on how we can do that. I've spoken at some of their conferences they have in London, and yeah, I wish them well. You know, as a new religious movement, they're quite important behind the scenes. And I'll just finish. Actually, I'm going to finish my my talk tonight with a reading from what's called the Great Invocation. It's something that they always say at their annual conference, which I've spoken at, and it was a prayer given out by Joel Cool through Alice Bailey, and thousands of people use this, the Great Invocation. From the point of light within the mind of God, let light stream forth into the minds of men. Let light descend on earth. From the point of love within the heart of God, let love stream forth into the hearts of men. May Christ return to earth. From the centre where the will of God is known, let purpose guide the little wills of men. The purpose which the masters know and serve. From the centre which we call the race of men, let the plan of love and light work out. And may it seal the door where evil dwells. Let light and love and power restore the plan on earth. And Alice Bailey said in her note, the above invocation of prayer does not belong to any person or group, but to all humanity.